There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, "Be without food, but don't be without shelter or home." Shelter is very important than food. I was working as much as you can work, like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Francis Torres, and I'm an Associate Director for Housing and Infrastructure here at the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy at BPC. Recognizing the foundational importance of housing, the Terwilliger Center works every day to advance policies that promote greater housing affordability and access. Today's event, Stuck in Place: How Housing Policies Shape Mobility and Economic Opportunity, delves into the critical intersection of housing policy and economic mobility. For generations, the ability to move to areas with greater economic opportunity has been a cornerstone of the American dream. However, zoning laws, restrictive housing covenants, outdated land use policies, and other areas of policy have increasingly hindered this mobility, driving up housing costs and limiting access to thriving communities. Our discussion today will explore how zoning and land use reforms can expand housing supply, as well as the policies needed to help families access areas of greater opportunity, and how federal, state, and local leaders can work together to unlock the housing market. Before we begin, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Ron Terwilliger, who I understand is listening in today, for his support and his abiding interest in advancing policies to strengthen low-income families' ability to access affordable housing in neighborhoods of greater opportunity. Now, to help us guide us through this complex topic, I'm pleased to welcome a distinguished panel of experts, starting with Yoni Applebaum, a social and cultural historian who is the deputy executive editor at The Atlantic and author of the new book, Stuck: How the Privileged and Property Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. This book also inspired our webinar title and has helped frame today's conversation. We also have Dr. Jenny Schutz, Vice President of Infrastructure and Housing at Arnold Ventures, where she leads initiatives aimed at identifying and enacting policies that can successfully expand housing supply and make it easier to build more and different types of housing. And rounding out our panel, we have Dr. Salim Firth, who is a Senior Research Fellow and Director at the Urbanity Project at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And he's a thought leader among housers who frequently advises local governments and testifies before state and local legislatures, and whose research focuses on housing production and land use regulation. So thank you all for participating in today's panel. Before we begin the conversation, I would like to remind our audience that if you have any questions, you can submit them in the YouTube chat. So without further ado, we'll start our conversation with an introductory segment on the insights from this new book, Stuck, and Yoni. So Yoni, in your book, you argue that restrictive zoning and land use regulations have made it harder for people to move to places with greater economic opportunity, which has led to a decline in mobility that has profound implications, in your view, for American society. I would love it if you could just walk us through the key crux of your argument here.
Yeah, well, you've laid it out there, actually. I think what the book tries to do is to recover the magnitude of the change that has happened over the last 50 years in the United States. And the best way to do that really is to look back and understand how the society functioned up to 50 years ago. America, one of the great gifts this country gave the world was a legal revolution that took place about 200 years ago that enabled people to choose the communities in which they intended to reside instead of those communities operating like members-only clubs that chose their own residents. And that was a profound human freedom that had never really been codified into law before these changes that took place in the early United States. And Americans respond to that freedom with really, they throw themselves into it. They move all over the place. At the peak, as best I can calculate this, 1 in 3 Americans is moving every year. And the Americans who move in any decade you want to measure it end up economically ahead of those who choose to stay in place. And those differences actually widen in the second generation. Their kids do even better than the kids of those who had remained. That's a consistent finding through time and place, that relocating toward opportunity raises people's economic fortune. So that's one of the things that I want to sort of drive home with the book is that this was the engine, not just of American prosperity broadly read. It made the country prosperous to a remarkable degree. It also was an engine of economic and social mobility. But I don't think you can measure that world just in economic terms. The other thing that constant infusion of new arrivals into growing places produced was a really distinctive culture. A culture that was, on the whole, more inclusive and welcoming. And it produced a much more vibrant civic life. You can track this. The communities that are adding residents, the periods of peak mobility are when our voluntary associations flourish, when our churches have members in the pews. It drives the kind of rich civic culture that Americans came to cherish and the Europeans came over and marveled at. And the other thing it did was it kept us constantly in contact with people who were coming from very different backgrounds, with different sets of assumptions. That produced all kinds of tensions. It's not a simple thing, pluralism, but it also enabled us to navigate those differences and to build a society that tried to turn them from weaknesses into strengths. And so during that golden age of American mobility, that was the kind of nation that giving people the opportunity to choose their own communities produced. And over the last 50 years, that number of Americans moving every year has fallen from about 1 in 5 to, we got new numbers in December, down to about 1 in 13. So it's a pretty profound change. And along with it, over the last 50 years, every subsequent decade has seen slower growth in GDP. Every subsequent decade has seen widening economic inequality and a greater inability for people to take hold of their destinies and to rise above the station in life that they were assigned at birth. Our identities are becoming increasingly heritable again instead of constructed through our own agency.
Thanks, Yoni. That's a great way to kick us off. And I would love to hear a little bit about how, among all those social consequences you've identified, how did zoning and land use regulations and that particular kind of policy contribute to this decline in mobility and its attendant consequences?
Yeah, so this is the history the book explores, and it's been told well by my fellow panelists too. But what changed was first a system of land use regulation that made every act of construction in the country subject to government approval. And that didn't in itself break the engine of American mobility, although it did increasingly segregate us out by income. And then a second set of changes, that was about 100 years ago, that we invent zoning. It's a novel system. It's a system everybody understands to be legal at the time that it's invented. It gets legalized and recognized by the courts. and it sort of creates these profound changes, but it doesn't stop us from moving. What does stop us from moving is a second set of changes about 50 years ago that create many more veto points in the system of granting those government approvals. In part, that's through the creation of new rights of action that enable people to sue even if they're not directly harmed by new construction, new review processes, new procedural requirements that can be challenged in court. What we effectively do is hand anyone with the time and the money and the resources and the anger, the ability to stop any project of which they disapprove. This is done, I should stress, largely for well-intentioned reasons. There are real harms to urban renewal and other large-scale redevelopment processes that spark these legal changes. But the aggregate effect is that it's gotten harder to build, and it specifically got harder to build in the progressive places that over those same decades were showing the fastest economic growth, the most opportunity, were the places where people most wanted to move to. And the constriction of new housing supply made it almost impossible for Americans to do what they'd always historically done, which was to leave places that were struggling and go to the places that were thriving. And that's had a really profound impact on the society as a whole. There's a great study out in California which shows that for every 10 points the progressive vote share went up, the number of new housing permits issued went down by another 30%. So it's a specific problem in urban areas, although not restricted to those urban areas. And as those changes go into effect, it gets harder and harder for people to move from the places that are struggling. When we get new economic disruptions, as we've always had, when industries decline, people are increasingly trapped in the cities where the industry has declined, where they face high levels of unemployment, concentrated economic privation, and they cannot relocate to the places where the new jobs are being created. That is, I just want to stress, really weird. That's not how America has historically worked. When our old industrial cities declined, people moved to new places. And then many of those cities later revivified. That there was nothing locked in stone about those sorts of changes. But it meant that the population shifted around, and through that dynamism, the country was able to reinvent itself. As we've locked ourselves in place, as we've grown stuck, it's gotten harder and harder for us to navigate the kinds of changes and disruptions that are inevitable to a dynamic economy. And it traces back to that basic constriction of the housing supply. If you make it too hard to build, they will not come.
Thanks, Yoni. It's excellent historical context. And certainly reading your book, it was really interesting to think about a time where moving day was perceived as this, common experience all across the country. And so the lack of mobility is clear just in how people experience moving now vis-a-vis 60, 80 years ago. Now, I'm going to open it up to the full panel. Many of our viewers will be familiar with your work, but even if they're not, you're all well known in the housing analysis and policy space, and you all agree that restrictive zoning has contributed in some way to current housing scarcity. Would love to just, at the general 30,000-foot view, kick off our full panel conversation by discussing what might be a realistic roadmap for scaling back some of these rules, for scaling back some of these excesses that Yoni identifies in his book, given the political dynamics of local control and the fact that a lot of these regulations are operating at the local level, not necessarily the state and federal level. And we can maybe start with Jenny.
Sure. So we see one of the most promising ways to get better regulations, more consistent regulations, and make it easier to build homes of all shapes and sizes across the country. The most promising lever is actually to take action at the state level. And part of this is sort of by default. The federal government has very few direct levers over housing supply and land use. Local governments have had control over this for the last 100 years. And many of them haven't used it particularly well. They've used it to exclude people who don't already live in a place. So state governments offer us a really nice lever to get access to this because states set the rules under which local governments operate. States originally had power over land use and the power to regulate construction. They delegated that to local governments through state zoning enabling acts starting in the 1920s. But because it was originally a state power, states can take that back, or they can put guardrails around what local governments are allowed to do. And so some of the most promising trends that we've seen are states doing things like, say, local governments aren't allowed to just blanket prohibit anything other than single-family detached homes on large lots. For instance, saying that local governments have to allow accessory dwelling units or duplexes or townhouses in their residential neighborhoods, so providing more diversity. There are a number of different ways states have been doing that. We're still very early in this process. It's only in about the last 5 or 6 years that we've seen kind of widespread interest in doing this. But that seems to me like one of the most promising areas for states to set some parameters or some incentives, then get local governments to modify their land use so that they are producing more consistently and creating more areas of opportunity.
Thank you, Jenny. Salim, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Jenny mechanically. I think that the thing that has to come first, and this is really where books like Yoni's come in, is we have to win hearts and minds. People like me and Jenny are kind of doing this day to day and thinking about very specific policy levers and statutes and ordinances. But ultimately, we can't trick Americans into changing the way that we manage land. And there has to be an embrace of, kind of the willingness to change, the idea that people should usually be allowed to do what they want on their land, as opposed to the idea that they should usually have to ask permission. And so building that broad public consensus is going to be a large project. And I think I'm impressed sometimes negatively when I talk to states, often kind of red states where they're still building a lot, and just talk to people who have been working there for 10 or 20 years. And they say, oh, it's so much harder to build than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And there's this momentum, right? So even as the conversation, among people like us in think tanks has changed, the momentum that was built by this localist revolution in the 70s, it's still going. And if nobody did anything, if nobody passed any more laws, it would get harder and harder to build as local officials around the country and state officials sort of exercise their powers with more vigor, right? Because that's where the direction has been going. Well, just how much authority do I have to say, I don't like the way that your building site is laid out? Give me another set of plans. Like, I'm ultimately going to approve you, but I want to see a few versions of this before I say which one is the best. And that's the kind of thing that now red states are seeing. And I think it's good to be reminded that we're trying to change something. We're trying to move a ship that's in motion and in motion in the wrong direction. And it's going to be a really big task.
But both of those are such good points. The only thing I'd sort of add, building on them, is that one way to conceive of this is that our current process is actually profoundly anti-democratic. That the further up you push these decisions, the more democratic they become. That the current process tends to privilege, for example, a hearing as a participatory process at which a handful of people who happen to have the knowledge of how to navigate the bureaucracy, free time on a given Wednesday night at 7 p.m., and the ability to arrange for childcare, or maybe no children living in their home anymore, to attend the hearing, and they go and they testify, right? That is, in practice, about the least participatory way you can possibly make decisions over land use. You push that up to municipal election, maybe you've got 20% of registered voters turning out on average. The median age is probably north of 60 in most municipal elections. And it's somewhat more representative, although it's preponderantly homeowners. It's a whiter, richer, better educated segment of the population than actually live in the municipality. You push that up another level to the state level, and all of a sudden you're talking about really involving a broad array of the citizenry in making these kinds of decisions. And so to Salim's point that we need to reframe the conversation, I do think it's important that as we discuss the right level at which these parameters should be set, that pushing it up to the state level is not about disempowering communities. It's about making the process more democratically accountable, involving more people in the conversation about what kind of a society we want to have, what kinds of opportunities we want to present, and what kinds of exclusion we're going to permit.
Thank you all for your insights there. Staying on that topic, Jenny, I would love to hear from you on the topic of state preemption of local land use rules. Where have you seen that approach work? There's been some notable developments in different states across the country where states are taking more action to increase housing supply and sort of establishing the frameworks that local governments have to use. So would just love to hear from you on what are some of the positive examples and lessons learned that we can look to.
Sure. One of the interesting things is that states are taking a pretty wide variety of different approaches to this. And we're still early in the process of observing how they work, but I'll give examples of 2 states that seem to have figured out effective ways to get more housing built in certain places and certain structure types. California's experience with legalizing accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, is really instructive, in part because it took them a very long time to get it right. So they started by trying to pass a statewide law that just said localities can't prohibit ADUs in residential areas, and left it at that. Well, it turns out that localities can then allow ADUs, but they add on all sorts of conditions. The person who lives in the ADU has to be related by blood or marriage to the person who lives in the main house. Well, that makes this less attractive if you want to rent it out as a source of income. So then the state closed off that loophole and said, all right, you can't have this restriction. State said, okay, localities said, all right, now we're going to require that you provide 2 off-street parking spaces for every ADU that you build. Well, very few people have a yard that's big enough for an ADU plus 2 additional parking spaces. And so they kept going through this cycle where local governments would find loopholes to try to evade the state mandate, and the state would close them off one at a time. It took them about a decade of closing off one loophole at a time before they got a relatively standard set of laws across all of localities. So ADUs can be built. You can't require off-street parking. You can't restrict who lives in it. There are parameters on size. It's a fairly straightforward process. And once they got to a set of standardized rules, the ADU industry in California really took off, in part because they were then providing the private market with clear, consistent guidelines for what they could build almost everywhere. Then you've got enough scale that there are new companies that are being created that just provide ADUs. And so they can go around and knock on the door and say, if you'd like an ADU, we have pre-approved designs, you can pick one. We'll walk you through the permitting process. We have lawyers who know what they're doing. We can give you financing assistance so that you can build this without tapping into your home equity. And so at that point, we realized that California had gone through this very important learning process that other states can learn from, not just how do you write a good ADU policy, but also that you really need to think through the way that localities will fight it. That's one example of preemption that worked, but took a while. Another example that's a really different approach is Florida's Live Local Act. So in 2023, Florida passed this law that said that developers can build multifamily buildings in commercial and industrial zones, so not residential areas, but on top of a strip mall, and they can build it as tall as the nearest building within, I think it's a mile, so using kind of the existing built environment as context for what they're allowed to do. Local governments didn't have to go back and rewrite their zoning. The developer could just go in and do this. They have to meet certain affordability requirements and they get some state tax offsets, but it made it a much more quick process to implement. The state said you're allowed to go and build this stuff without waiting for local governments to revise their zoning. And they have managed to get, I think, about 30,000 units already built or in the pipeline in a very short period of time. So that's a really different approach than what California has taken, but seems to be very effective so far. And I think this is a great example that states are experimenting with what works in their housing market, in their political and institutional context. And that's great because we can observe lots of different options and figure out what's likely to work.
Thanks, Jenny. That's excellent context. Moving over to Salim, you've written in the past about the importance of what you've called big, simple reforms, as well as the focus on streamlining housing permitting in the different states and how that's a key aspect of this conversation. If a governor were to ask you, what's the fastest route to making more affordable housing in my state? What would your answer be?
Yeah, so Jenny sort of took my answer with this residential and commercial zones. I would caution, if there's any legislators on here, there are better models than Florida. In Florida, it's illegal to downzone at the local level, which made it much easier for them to write that bill in a way that it couldn't be gamed by localities. So if you're looking at writing a residential and commercial zone bill, do it, absolutely. But unless you also have this Florida power in your back pocket, you're going to need to use some more complicated mechanics. But I think that why big and simple as opposed to The other thing I do, I spend a lot of time on small and arcane because there's a million little small and arcane things to change. But what we saw in both of the examples that Jenny gave are a case where the state says, here's something you can build. And so it's sort of an affirmative yes. Like, here's a model that you can do over and over again in lots of different places, as opposed to the sort of negative, well, a locality can't block X. Because if they can't block X, well, they can block Y, and Y turns out to be just as effective as X. And so then you're playing whack-a-mole forever, as opposed to the very effective approach is, here's something you can definitely build. The other thing that I would add to those that's on that scale with the accessory dwelling units in California and the residential and commercial zones is probably smaller minimum lot sizes or eliminating minimum lot sizes. So there's one good example of where cities should have minimum lot sizes, and that's when houses are using septic systems. So they're disposing of waste on site, and it needs some amount of soil to leach into, or you'll start polluting the local waterways. If you've got sewers, there's no particular reason to limit how much land people consume. My friend Alain Berthaud, who's a great urbanist, has worked all over the world. And one of the things that governments love to do is put minimum consumption standards, right? So they say, and especially in context of the countries that are much poorer than the US, they'll say, well, it's indecent for anybody to live in less than 100 square meters. So we're going to have a minimum unit size of 100 square meters. Well, that's great if you can afford it. But if you can't afford it, having the right to have that doesn't create the unit for you. So all you've done is push the poor half of your population into the informal market, where they then lose legal protections. And Alain has a great principle, which is, if the buyer or renter can see the product, or if the feature of the product, then it doesn't need to be regulated. So something like the size of a house, if you go and look at it and you say, wow, this is tiny, you can figure that out. There's no mystery. The stuff that you can't see, like whether it was structurally sound when it was built, that's hidden away in the walls. And there it's good to have regulation, because you don't want people having to come with like subsurface scanners to figure out if the studs were all put in correctly. So we have regulations for the things that buyers can't observe, that they just wouldn't know if this was built correctly, if the septic system works, for instance. But the stuff they can see, how big is your unit, how many toilets does it have, all that sort of stuff, the buyer can figure that out instantly, and they can decide their trade-offs of, well, it is really tight, this is really small, but it gives me great access to my job, or it gets my kids into a school district that I never could have afforded otherwise. And those are the kinds of trade-offs that we should trust people to make.
Excellent. Thank you. Going back to Yoni and to another chapter of this conversation, I want to highlight 3 principles that you raised in your book that you argue should shape policy responses to the mobility crisis and the broader housing crisis, in as much as it impacts mobility. And these 3 principles are tolerance, consistency, and abundance. Can you briefly explain your reasoning behind these 3?
Yeah, and they are in some ways simply restating points that Jenny and Salim are making here, right? So tolerance has to do with knowing that all of us at different stages of our life are going to require different kinds of housing. The different populations require different kinds of housing. My first rental apartment when I graduated college and went to work for the city of New York was 150 square feet. It would not have met Salim's 100 square meter standard, right? It was pretty small. It's not where I would have raised my family, but it allowed me to put a roof over my head and to take a job that felt really meaningful to me, and to do some good work. I live in a single family home now. It's great. I love it. I don't know that I will always be able to navigate as many stairs. I may need a single level unit at some point. And similarly, we have outlawed most forms of housing for the poor in this country, and as a result have a mounting homelessness crisis. There need to be some basic standards around housing, as Salim says, but we also need to develop a much greater tolerance for a wide variety of housing types, And I have a very typical story as well. My single family home would not be legal to build today. It's on a lot that is too small under the current ordinances in Washington, and it's too close to the property line. But when it was wedged in there, the high school teacher who erected it was able to find a place in which to raise his family. High school teachers today can't afford my neighborhood. And that's a result of the kinds of restrictions that make houses like the one I live in, which is small but sufficient, illegal to build. And so that's the first thing, is just tolerate a much wider array of housing types, know that the things that work for us may not be the things that other people desperately need. The second, which gets to Jenny's point, is consistency. If you can give clear guidelines to builders over the broadest geographical areas possible, often statewide or at least regional, and have those consistent rules allowing them to build ideally as of right, but at the very least with some minimal amount of review, you give them predictability. And that makes such a huge difference in the financing of projects, in the willingness of people to go ahead to build. And it enables greater competition. Many builders today, unfortunately, specialize in navigating abstruse bureaucracy in particular jurisdictions almost more than they do in the design and layout of buildings. In jurisdictions that have experimented with this outside of the United States, these sorts of reforms have increased productivity and lowered housing prices. Being able to have consistent rules over broad areas is really important. And then the third is that we need a lot of housing. We've spent 50 years making it really, really hard to build in this country. And this is one where when I talk to audiences, I often tell them, I'm asking them not to believe their own lying eyes. Most Americans have had the experience of being told that their area needs more housing, seeing more housing go up, and seeing the prices rise. And that is sort of the ground level observation that people make. And they draw a natural conclusion from this, which is that the erection of new housing in their neighborhood drove up prices. If all you're doing is sort of giving a teaspoon of medicine to a bathtub of need, like it just doesn't go very far. And so we need to build enough housing, not just to house everyone in America. Freddie Mac says that's something like 4 million units. But we need enough housing to allow everyone in America to live where they want, to live in the communities where they can give their children more opportunity, to live in the places where the economy is growing. That's going to take a lot more, because a lot of the existing housing is not in places where people would ideally live, not in the places they want to live. And so we need to build enough to give people choice again. And I think if we follow those three broad guidelines, and we can talk more about how to specifically implement them, and already started that conversation, then we'll be in a pretty good place.
Thank you, Yoni. And I think that sets us up perfectly for the next set of questions. I know both Jenny and Salim have a lot to say on this topic of abundance. More broadly, this conversation and a lot of the recent work that all three of you have done is taking place against the backdrop of broader discussions on abundance and an abundance agenda. And certainly, I think, as you point to, a core tension in this discourse is how do you square the need that there seems to be for broad deregulatory reforms with policies that address those concerns about rising costs and help keep lower income households stably housed and shielded from displacement. So would love to hear a little bit on how do each of you think about that challenge in your work? And perhaps Salim, we could start with you.
Yeah, so it's a great question, but I actually don't think there's a tension between broadly allowing the construction of housing and keeping lower income people stably housed. There's a huge tension between local control and keeping low income people stably housed. And so when we look at the neighborhoods where there has been a lot of displacement, they're usually neighborhoods that have, kind of nicer old housing stock that when a gentrifier comes in and fixes it up, it looks great, right? So Hoboken, New Jersey, or parts of Brooklyn are the canonical examples here. They didn't build. Instead, they had very attractive old housing, which had been chopped up into small apartments. And gentrifiers came in and got, glowing New York Times profiles written about them for doing this great work of historical preservation and, restoring single family homes that had been turned into 4 small apartments. That's a tension. So if you want to have great historical preservation and restoration of beautiful buildings, if you want to have local control and not build a lot, well, then you have a big tension. But if you do what Hoboken is doing more recently, or what Jersey City next door is doing, and build a ton of new housing, well, then you don't have much of a tension because there's somewhere for everyone who wants to live in Jersey City, which New York across the river can't say.
Thank you, Salim. Jenny, I know you definitely have thoughts on this.
I do. So I think one of the most helpful ways to think about this is the best way to prevent displacement in low-income neighborhoods is to build a ton of shiny new housing in neighborhoods that are already very wealthy and expensive. And that's precisely what we haven't done. So New York is a great example. If we were doubling the number of homes that exist in the West Village and the Upper East Side and Upper West Side, you would have a lot less new development going to Harlem, going to Brooklyn, going to Queens. We've protected the wealthiest neighborhoods from any change, whether that's tearing down existing buildings or adding new ones. So we've frozen in amber the wealthy neighborhoods, and then all of the growth goes to the nearest neighborhood where they're allowed to build. And so that's when we start getting complaints of neighboring areas, which feel like they're absorbing all of the new growth and then having displacement. I think it's also important to remember that we focus more on displacement where an old apartment building gets torn down and replaced by a new apartment building. But the vast majority of displacement is when the rent goes up because we're not building enough, and people are displaced because they can no longer afford to stay in the neighborhood. I think it's also really important to talk explicitly about sort of the interaction between rule changes that allow any kind of housing, both market rate and affordable, and what that does for the capital A affordable housing. So you can't build a LIHTC project, a subsidized apartment building, in places where zoning won't allow you to build apartment buildings. The zoning is binding for affordable as well. In areas where there's more rental housing available, it's easier for people who receive federal vouchers to find an apartment that is available and within the rent guidelines and to lease it up, right? It's hardest for people to use those vouchers in very tight markets that don't have additional housing coming online. So there's sometimes been a political tension between the capital A affordable housing advocates and the abundant housing advocates. And that tension shouldn't really be there. They are both aligned around we need to have more housing available at lots of different price points, lots of different shapes and sizes of buildings, so that people can use their subsidy, so that subsidy dollars can go farther and cover more households. So there should be a stronger alliance there. And that's one of the political boundaries that's sort of been artificial, and we're trying to build bridges across it.
Thank you both for those insights. They certainly reflect how we think about this at BPC, and part of why in our work we talk often about the need to increase supply, preserve existing affordable housing, and also strengthen programs that allow low-income Americans and families to stay housed. So yeah, definitely a yes and approach is consistent with what we do here. So just moving back to Yoni and the book, a central thrust of your narrative is that many Americans are now trapped quite far from economic opportunity. In our work, BPC has supported bipartisan federal proposals to tackle that problem. Bills like the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, the Choice and Affordable Housing Act, which, among other proposals, would just help more families move to opportunity-rich areas by reforming some federal programs. Did your historical research for the book shed light on any earlier efforts by the federal government or otherwise to support economic integration in places that resist it?
Yeah, it's not an easy history. It is hard if you allow local communities to govern their own boundaries, to decide who they will include and who they will exclude. That they will almost invariably privilege the interests of those who are already resident over those who might come and join them. I think that's the consistent theme of the history of this. And that goes back, I should say, to, Puritan villages warning out new arrivals. There's a long, old American history of this kind of exclusion that gets practiced on the basis of class in America, that invariably also means on the basis of race. And it's a tough history to grapple with. A lot of the programs that BPC and other housing reformers support are about restoring a degree of agency to people and how they make these decisions, sometimes giving them counseling or other support to help, if they're not as familiar with how to navigate the locating new housing, the rental process, gives them support in that as well, and those interventions have shown to be very effective. But to build on Jenny's point, all of this gets easier if you are building a lot of new housing. The same pot of Section 8 funds supports many more families if the housing costs are lower. And right now, I think a lot of federal policy is perverse in two different ways. One is if you're lucky enough, not with Section 8, but with many other affordable housing programs, if you're lucky enough to get into the affordable housing, you'd have to be out of your mind to ever leave it. You have a winning lottery ticket. And even if you get offered a better job, even if you could relocate to a better school district, you'd have to think really hard about giving up the permanently entailed affordable unit that you've landed, or you finally got off a public housing wait list, and it's a huge risk to move someplace new and to start over, even if you'd be earning a lot more. And so a lot of our policies are really tilted against mobility. And I think that's a real challenge that some of the programs that you mentioned are intended to address by giving people the ability to exercise that choice. And then the other part of it is again, to Jenny's point, that the housing opportunities, even if you have the portability of the vouchers, even if you have the counseling, you still can't move into the suburb with the best school district because there are no rental units there, right? It's all single family homes on 1 acre lots. And so it doesn't matter sort of how pegged to rental prices in the metro district the vouchers become. If there is no rental inventory for you to find, you're not going to be able to use it. And so this is where there's no way around fundamentally moving some of these decisions up from the local level or getting localities to change the rules to become more inclusive, because there's only so far that you can go with these very good programs that are about restoring choice if you don't address simultaneously, I think, some of the constraints on supply.
Thank you, and it's very insightful. And I will wonder if relatedly we could have a conversation now with Salim and Jenny as well on how can we reframe this idea of accessing to opportunity-rich communities, right? The proverbial single-family home communities on a 1 acre lot, as a shared goal rather than the perceived threat. Particularly for neighborhoods where there are people that might resist new housing or denser development for different reasons. So really kind of harkening back, Salim, to your point at the start of the conversation of winning hearts and minds, what are some ideas around how to have a broader coalitional support for this accessing opportunity-rich communities idea?
Yeah, I absolutely go back to the idea that you have to win hearts and minds here, partly because I don't want to go scorched earth on localities. So I grew up in one of these Puritan towns in Massachusetts, and they take a lot of abuse, but they are also among the oldest continuously functioning democracies in the world. And we shouldn't completely toss that out because they got this policy area wrong for the last 10th of their existence. And so I believe that there's redemptive hope. But part of that has to be that people have different ideas, that people believe different things about their community. And yeah, so there's a whole bundle of things. And part of the work that's being done, I think, especially left of center, is saying, hey, you can't be a good progressive if you're standing against allowing renters in your neighborhood, right? Like in a Black Lives Matter era, it does not make any sense at all to say, to put the BLM sign next to the, no apartments here sign. A few people still do it and we like to make fun of them, but that work is being done. I think on the right, there's partly because most Republicans live in cheaper areas. These tensions haven't been advanced as much, but part of that might be saying, hey, we have HOAs and condo associations, ways to govern collectively the really, really small area directly where you live, like what's going to actually be coming up and down your street. And we don't have to ban apartments from the city to feel like we have control over our immediate surroundings, and being able to take advantage of some of these new forms of governance to liberalize elsewhere, and to say we can have some level of really direct, really, really localized democracy. But that doesn't have to be exclusionary. So I think those are going to be hard. It's going to be hard. And I hope we don't feel like we have to choose between having robust local government and having inclusive communities.
I think it's also really important that we not always frame this as an eat your broccoli argument, that you have to accept the housing that you don't want because that's good for you and, it's eating your fiber. There's some really powerful arguments that resonate with virtually all kinds of demographic groups and both sides of the aisle. One of them is reminding people that we are providing housing for people who already work in communities. So next time you go to the grocery store or you go to the coffee shop, ask your barista, ask your cashier, do they live close to where they work? And almost certainly the answer is no. They have to live far away because it's the only place they can be. Where do your kids' teachers live? Where do firefighters live? Providing housing that essential workers who are already in the community can afford so they can live close to their jobs is something that everybody understands intuitively, and that's very powerful. Thinking also about providing homes for people at different points in their life cycle. So, ask people in exclusionary wealthy communities, could your kids move back to the area where they grew up and buy their first home? And again, always the answer is no, because people starting off early in life can't afford to buy a single family house on an acre of land. So we should be building things like townhouses and condos to allow people to get a foot on the ladder of homeownership and building wealth. Very powerful messaging that virtually everybody recognizes. Older adults who might want to right size, as Yoni mentioned before, moving out of a single family house, maybe into a nice elevator building that's fully accessible for older adults. We can only have that if you're allowed to build the elevator buildings. So there are lots of these arguments that resonate on both sides of the aisle. There are some that work better in Republican or Democratic leaning areas. So as Salim mentioned, sort of, concerns over property rights resonates very well in a lot of the Western states that have this sort of strong libertarian tradition. Economic growth, powerful pretty much everywhere. In some places, environmental advocates have been very helpful. If you build compact housing that's close to job centers and transit, it allows people to drive less. That's better for emissions. So we sort of come up with this mixture of arguments that can be persuasive to a lot of different audiences, but reminding people of the benefits of having more growth, having more houses, having more people live in your community supports neighborhood serving retail. Who doesn't want an extra coffee shop and a nice taco truck in their neighborhood?
Thank you both for that context. Salim, I want to go back to something you mentioned, sort of frame my question around it. You've done a lot of academic research on zoning patterns in the Twin Cities region, showing that upzoning can promote racial integration. So getting at that point of how there are situations where communities that are nominally very progressive on racial issues and might say they are pro-racial integration may be engendering an environment where that's not as likely. And yet it sounds like there's been some key reforms, or at least some trends in that part of the country where there has been a quantifiable increase in the rate of racial integration. So would love to hear a little bit about your key findings and what lessons other cities can take from the Twin Cities on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think important to note, we weren't looking at changes in zoning. We're just looking at differences across space, snapshot in time. And there's a lot of things we didn't do. This was work with Mary Jo Webster, who's there in the Twin Cities, and she and I think what we did was we formalized the conventional, well-accepted wisdom, and we just said we're able to go into the data and measure something that everybody who worked in this space already knew, which is that especially in an environment like the Twin Cities, where there's the biggest homeownership gap in the country relative to the rest of the U.S. White people living in the Twin Cities area are significantly more likely to be homeowners, and Black people are significantly less likely to be homeowners. So there's this huge homeownership gap. And in that context, what that means is, and the same elsewhere, but maybe to a lesser extent, if you don't have rental housing, you can't have much racial integration. And the way that, for a variety of reasons, some of them have to do with tax law, some of them are just the basic physics of buildings, right? Like if you have a single family home, it's relatively easy for one person to manage it, to take care of it. If you have a large apartment building, it's relatively easy to have a single unified property manager. So it makes sense to have rentals in big buildings and ownership in small buildings. It's not the only way to do things. There's plenty of condo oriented societies around the world. But in the US context, usually multifamily is rental, single family is ownership. And so that means if you only build single family buildings, you're almost only going to get owners. And in the Twin Cities, especially, you're almost, I shouldn't say only because it's much more diverse than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But you're going to get a preponderance of white people living in your community. And so what we found was that whether you're in the central cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul or in the suburbs, zoning for multifamily housing created a significantly more diverse population. And so that's not kind of block level integration, right? So there's still segregation in the sense that you've got these single family neighborhoods which have homeowners, and then next to them or across the street, you've got an apartment complex, but those folks are going to mix in the schools and in the local stores. People who are renting there might be able to get that job close to their home in an affluent suburb. And so I think we were just kind of formalizing what everybody already knew, which is that if you want to create opportunity for residential integration, you have to zone for multifamily. And we put a number on that for one U.S. municipality. I'm hoping to expand that work to other cities. As Jenny knows, data availability is a real problem. And so we were piggybacking on Mary Jo and her colleagues' work, digitizing the zoning maps in the Twin Cities. That work just has not been done in enough of the US.
Thank you, Salim. I have a lot of more questions, but I will be consolidating some of them in the interest of time. And us being a DC-based think tank, it would be remiss of me to not bring up some questions as to what the role of federal government can be here and different levels of government. So opening it up to all of you, whoever wants to comment, we're in an increasingly divided, polarized political environment. Would love to hear who, in your view, should lead on the subject of housing abundance. Should the leadership on this come from federal, state governments, local governments? And what's the most effective role for policymakers or leaders at each level of government to play here?
Let me throw out a thought on that, which is two historical examples of the federal government taking the lead on this issue. The first is one that Jenny referenced earlier, the State Zoning Enabling Act. That was a voluntary role for the federal government, which convened a committee to draft a model statute and then spread it around to the states. And the states overwhelmingly adopted it. And that's still sort of the fundamental substrate of zoning today. So that's one kind of role that the federal government often takes on these issues, is convening experts, drafting some sort of model statute that can create not federal uniformity, but a basis of state level adaptation. At the opposite end of the spectrum, that was Herbert Hoover. You zoom a decade or so into the future, and you have FDR's New Deal taking a very different approach, which is that most municipalities in America still didn't have zoning when the New Deal goes into effect. And it is the Federal Housing Administration which redlines neighborhoods if they're not zoned. And so that is what really drives the coast-to-coast adoption of zoning statutes at the local level, is that the federal government basically says, we will not underwrite any home loans in your jurisdiction unless you zone, and not just zone, but zone according to these parameters, right? Separate residential districts, permanently racially segregated in the initial version of this. Right, so that's the coercive model of federal intervention, where the feds have huge hammers they can wield if they choose to on this stuff, and there's ample precedent on the books for them doing so. We have the zoning regime that we have today, in other words, because of those two different kinds of interventions that came from the federal government. And I think it's important to remember that, because often when the subject of federal intervention gets raised, it's treated as if like this will be the feds tampering with some sacrosanct local privilege. And in fact, it's the opposite. This was sort of two federal initiatives that pushed this down at the local level, often over the ardent protests of local communities. So there's ample precedent for federal intervention. That said, we have an entirely dysfunctional Congress and an administration that seems not particularly focused on this issue. And so I think that the most fruitful fields at the moment are those at the state and local level. That is where the change can easily be implemented. It doesn't require any kind of federal action or federal intervention. But I do think it's important to remember that the system we have today was in some sense a federal creation and not just some sort of organic growth at the state and local level.
And I'll just jump in to say that Yoni's given us some really important examples that the federal government can have big, important impacts, either for good or for ill. And so, for me, the first motto for Congress and the administration should be do no harm. And the federal government hasn't directly intervened in land use in a while. There are proposals floating around the Hill to create federal financial carrots or sticks for states and local governments to rewrite their zoning. That's actually complicated to get right, and the potential to get it wrong is, I think, pretty high, and the impact would be quite bad if it got it wrong. So I hope that Congress sort of takes baby steps and thinks quietly, does its homework, does lots of research to figure out what the impact would be. This is a great area to do some pilot programs that are small, that are temporary, to test out how you could do this effectively before rolling out something at scale. One of the areas that both the administration and Congress has expressed some interest in is using federal lands to build more housing. This can take a variety of different flavors. A lot of the attention is on Bureau of Land Management lands, mostly in the Western United States, that would be available for things like additional single-family subdivisions outside cities like Salt Lake City and Las Vegas. So that's one flavor. But it's also important to remember the federal government owns a lot of land in the urban core. So if you think about, for instance, surface parking lots around Amtrak stations are absolutely screaming for apartments and mixed commercial use. And so figuring out a consistent way to allow that around Amtrak stations and then letting the market build where there is actually demand and where people would want to live there. The federal government has a lot of office buildings, which may not be used. A more consistent and transparent way for transferring underused federal properties, either doing long-term leases for joint development or selling them to the private sector, things like the U.S. Postal Service land. So I think having a better federal inventory and then being thoughtful about how those could be used in different ways without making it an enormously complicated process, which today it is. So I think the federal government has some levers. There are also some very, very technocratic things, but that are important and that only the federal government can do. So better data on housing production, knowing how many houses we build in different locations and different structure types, would make it easier to evaluate how these state and local reforms are working. Really important role in research and development, disseminating information, working with private industry to do things like test out new building materials, construction techniques, and then sharing information about what works. I mean, the federal government has unprecedented reach to lots of stakeholders, and so making that information freely available, pushing it out to people so that they can use it, those are core functions of government.
Yeah, the federal government has so many touch points in housing already. I would love to see people who work in the federal space and care about housing dive into some of those. They're really poorly understood. Things like Army Corps of Engineers stormwater approval, federal approvals for local sewer systems end up being a major barrier to expansion of those sewer systems, which is something that urbanists really want. There are areas like building codes where the federal government can take a unique role. And so getting federal policy folks to dig into the stuff the federal government is already doing on housing finance, especially, and finding the ways that can contribute. I think that would complement the work that the states and localities are doing on zoning, rather than having a federal role in zoning, which might just as easily turn into something that we regret as much as we regret the Hoover administration and then FDR and then the urban renewal era. Like the federal government does not have a great record of getting the solutions right when it finally mobilizes to deal with bubbling up housing crises.
Excellent. Thank you all for those great insights. I'm going to dedicate the last few minutes here to at least a couple of audience questions. But before we do that, I want to take the opportunity to invite all our viewers to attend BPC's upcoming 4th Annual Summit on Housing Supply Solutions, which will be taking place on June 18th at DC's Union Station. We're bringing together an excellent roster of housing experts, practitioners, and policymakers who are at the leading edge of this issue at federal, state, and local levels. So if you want to keep hearing conversations like this one, we hope that you join us there. You won't want to miss out. The event is free to attend, and you can register using the link that should be in the chat. So with that out of the way, I'll just throw out an audience question from Leslie Gooch from the Manufactured Housing Institute. HUD code manufactured housing can address housing needs across the country. Local zoning hurdles based on outdated perceptions hinder its full potential. Are any of you seeing progress to overcome these hurdles? What more needs to be done? Any thoughts
Yeah,
on any?
several states have moved to require localities to allow manufactured housing where they allow stick built. Those laws are difficult to write in practice, and I think we also need to see some progress on allowing the form of a manufactured home park, but with fee simple lot ownership.
Yeah, and I'll just say that this is an area where clearly the technology has outstripped public perceptions. So most people hear manufactured housing and they think of 1970s trailer parks. Manufactured modular housing takes a lot of different forms. And so, that's one of the ways that we potentially can build more homes with fewer workers on site, which is important since we have a construction labor shortage. It's one of the ways we can bring down the hard costs of construction. And so we need to be open to innovation and testing out new models.
Thank you both. And then to close it off, a question from Luca Gattoni-Celli, I hope I got that right, from the Yimbys of Northern Virginia. And actually, this might be particularly relevant, Yoni, to your book, but to all of your work. Does the story of spatial mobility in America offer strategic lessons for the Yimby movement, or does it mostly affirm the importance of building more housing in places with jobs and opportunity?
I think to build on some points that were made earlier, that I tried to tell a story about people. And I think that when the conversation is about FARs and lot sizes and buildings, that's a conversation that the advocates of mobility and of housing tend to lose. It keeps people focused on the changes to their physical environment, and people are change averse. But if you make the conversation about people and about values, it starts to be a really different conversation. If it's about whether the nurses and the daycare workers and the firefighters in your community can live in your community, or whether a poor family halfway across the country ought to have the chance to come and take part in your community, become your neighbors, send their daughter to school with your daughter. That's a very different kind of conversation. Or if the conversation is about what kind of a country we want to be, whether we want to be a country that enables people to build their own destinies, to rise above the circumstances into which they were born, or we want to be a country where privilege and success are largely inherited and closed off to those who were unfortunate enough to be born into privilege. Those are conversations that I think the advocates of housing and mobility tend to win. Most Americans want two sets of contradictory things. We're change-averse creatures. It's hard to allow changes in our built environments. It can be difficult to navigate through that moment of change in our social environments. But when the conversation is not just about what's going to change, but we stand to gain and what we believe, then I think you end up with a very different kind of outcome.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think that's all the time we have. This was a very interesting and fruitful conversation. I'm very grateful to our excellent panelists for their insights. Building the evidence base for reforms to tackle the housing shortage and enable families to move to opportunity will continue to be priorities here at the BPC. And we hope that you visit our website and check out our work. We also hope to see you all at our summit on June 18th. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Have a great day.